Susan. Susie's whom we used to call her.
So I'll bet 15. Yeah.
Check. Got my timer set up. All right, Tanttila's tubular talkers. What is your topic?
The history of modern computers.
Excellent, thank you. Audience, are you ready? Group, are you ready? And proceed. And not proceed. And take a moment. Try clicking it.
It's problem last time. This is exactly what happened. Actually, both times. Like, it was really fun. Oh, sorry.
Smartboard still blank. Went.
Try a different USB port on your.
We did.
Yeah. Yeah. Modern computers, no. They don't want to be. They don't want to be talked about.
We want this. Go back. It hard enough for us.
Do you think it's a problem with the smartboard or computer? So I can bring my computer back.
No, it's the smart one because I had it working before class.
Oh.
Okay, go back.
Okay, the little buttons work.
Blue button.
The little buttons have the screen.
Yeah.
The big buttons
The
work.
big buttons work. Okay. I apologize about that. Let's get back into it. All right, audience, are you ready?
Yes.
Group, are you ready? And proceed.
A majority of us in this room have had our lives impacted by computers in one way or another. And for most of us, it started at a very young age. I, for one, remember the first time my dad brought an iPad home and I played Fruit Ninja and Angry Birds for hours because I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Now, technology hasn't always been like this. It's gone through a lot of different evolution throughout the years, and it's changed an immense amount, especially in the last 20 years. There's a lot of different interpretations of when the first computer was made. However, today we're going to be starting in the 1930s because that was one of the first modern computers that was deemed modern by the scientists at the time. There's a lot of different motivations that go into the progression of computers. The first one being World War II. World War II started in the 1930s, and this push was mainly because a lot of the people at this time were going against each other in the wars, and they were wanting to have better technology than their opponents to be able to get a leg up in the war and to be able to be successful in the war.
And coming off of this with technology wasn't the time, you saw the potential. People saw the different ideas of what they could do, creating their own designs. So they went into more of a competitive environment, make and polish their brands, which are better, make it so people can afford them, people can get them. And with that, you have the competition of technology.
And then coming out of this age of competition, we strive more into an age of cooperation and innovation, and we get into this smart A technology explosion that we are still kind of riding through today.
So starting off in the 1930s, the first use of the word computer actually happened in 1613, and that was from Richard Braithwaite in his book, The Young Man's Leaning. And he actually used this word to describe a person instead of an actual machine. And this is the way it was up until the 1900s, because they hadn't made these machines yet known as computers to do computing. It was just people doing the calculations and math and things like that. And that's from Computer Hope 2021. And as I said earlier, a lot of the early development in these computers was because of World War II. They were needing to calculate trajectories and to better their communications over long distances. And that's from History.com in 2021. And the big push in World War II was super significant because if they hadn't had that war to push the evolution of computers, we probably wouldn't be where we are today because they had to develop so much in that war. In the 1930s, we're going to start off with Konrad Zuse. He was a German scientist, and he was the one that made the Z2 computer, which is ultimately what people view as the first modern computer of its time. And that's from EW 2019. His computer was a very significant step because it looked more like a modern computer and it had more functionalities than a modern computer. Because before this, what mainly was seen was just a calculator type machine. And this was a big push to have more of a screen and more in-depth calculations. And moving into the 1940s, we have the Anasoff Berry computer from 1942. And this computer was very significant because it solved a patenting issue. A lot of the people at this time were worried about, or they were making different types of their computers. And there was a lot of people who were wanting to patent the idea because it was such a popular design at the time. However, with this computer, they went to court and they actually decided that you couldn't put a patent on the idea of a computer because of how broad of a subject it was. And then moving into the Colossus from 1944, this was used to decode German messages. It was a British computer, and both of those are from Computer History 2022. Next, moving on to the ENIAC, and this was just a super significant computer because it was over 1,000 times faster than all of its leading competition. And this was an American computer made in 1946, and that's from the University of Pennsylvania. Now, when we get to the 50s, this was when World War II had just ended, and a lot of people were making those strides without the pressure of war. And so the Era 1101 from 1950 was a really big computer because it was the first computer to be marketed in a bigger way instead of just having one computer that they built for a college. And so it was actually sold to the US Navy, and they implemented it into their different ships and ports and things of that nature. And then also the SEAC was the first computer scan image, and you can see it right here. The man that was able to do the scan actually did it of the sun. And the picture that you see right there is actually blown way out of proportion. It was actually 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters, but it was still very significant for the time. And both of those are from Computer History Museum 2022. And then finally, the 60s, the IBM 1400 series computer was super big for the United States because this was the first computer to be sold world or nationwide and was in over half of the homes of the time. Also the Sketchpad from 1963 was very significant because before this machine, most of the computers at the time were only used for calculations and things of that nature, but this incorporated art into the computer world. And so it's just really cool to see things like that. And then finally, the ARPANET was a very significant network that was able to connect a bunch of different types of computers because previously only computers that were made by the same manufacturers were able to communicate with each other, but this network was able to spread that out over the nation and communicate with different types of computers at different times. And all of those are from Computer History.
And as you branch off this into the 1970s towards later 1990s, this is when you get more of the competition of technology and just the expansion of personal use. Starting early off in the 1970s, already you have competition with the handheld 470. In 1970, the Computer History Museum states that 470B/6 was the company's first product and ran the same software as IBM System 370 computers, but cost less and was smaller and faster. So you have this piece of technology which is smaller and faster, making it a better piece, and you already have companies starting to compete to try to get better designs and better products. And with this, you have this idea of, well, what if we expanded more? So you start to get the first supercomputer with the Fairchild. This was mainly used for like big calculations of dealing with weather, and later designs are built off of it. And you also have the condensed technology like a calculator. That's one of the first actual handheld calculators, which, as we know today, calculators are pretty useful, especially the ones that we commonly use. They're pretty fancy what they can do. Dealing with language as well, like for programming, the C language, it made programming a lot easier and a lot more understandable. So you get more people into this, more people means more jobs, means more opportunities, means more people with more ideas to work and make this technology more effective and a lot better as it is. You'd originally think that networks started in a place and then would go on the move, but actually it was the opposite. One of like the first mobile networks was through like these packet bands. This was like in the San Francisco Bay Area in like the mid-70s, mobile network. Fallon showed an article about an SRI event. So was this venue was chosen to mark the occasion of the first internet transmission on August 27, 1976. So like kind of looks like some like spy band, but it's a network that started originally on the move before it became centralized to one point. And with this, you also get just local and short networks. You didn't have anything massive or expanding just yet, but you were able to connect on a close level. So people with these computers, which is this where you get the personal usage of computers, where people can connect locally as well, or in like a smaller region. The Zero Park Alto, this was a really expensive computer. It was History Computer 2021. One Alto initially cost around $10,000 to build, so it wasn't a personal computer, but it was more so like a big industry, big design computer. And this is already in the mid-70s. So thinking about that, the technology was already pretty expansive and pretty great for the time, and this was already a while ago. The Tandem 16. This was actually used for ATM functions and monitoring stocks. So computers branching off into this branch into the stock market, things like that, and give a lot of what makes the world evolve today through the function of computers and expanding and making it more industrial. And from that Fairchild before, this is just a lot better one. It's the gray one. It was $10 million to make it. It took a year to make it, but it was used by the military for nuclear bomb simulation and weather simulation and different parts like that. So it was just a really big piece of technology. It just could do a lot. It was meant for people with a lot of money that have it. So governments and just big businesses to do their simulations and what they wanted to do. This is the use of like celebrity figures. It's not too significant to computers, but the involvement of celebrities makes it notable. Is this the Queen of England? She sent an email of transatlantic, so that became brought big attention to the idea of computers and technology. The Apple One, this is at like the end of getting towards the end of the 70s, is a single board computer. So it's the idea of making something smaller and more compact, which is where you get the original idea of having a small computer. And this is also another company that competes as well. Single board computer by Steve Wozniak, marketed by Steve Jobs. And from that, then you get the Apple II. There were millions of them sold, and there were thousands that were given away to different schools and different things like that. So you're bringing younger people into the idea of computers. Younger people in computers also gets them more interested in investing. The C++ language, just an even easier way and more effective to do programming. More people in the programming means more people with it. And when you have more people and it's easier to get into, have more people working and making these computers. PC Limited, this is where you also get Michael Dell, and this is where you get the Dell brand and everything with this. He actually quit college and created his own brand and made his market, his own computer, making his own design. So this is where you actually get another competitive items. We've all heard of Dell. So you also get other competitions. Next, Steve Jobs left the company, started making his own computers, so you have even more competition with it. This was a $6,500 computer, so it was pretty pricey and expensive, but it's also another piece of technology, which is these computers get faster and better, and they compete more and more. So with more competition, you have companies trying to beat the other one and get ahead of you. The World Wide Web, this was just a better way just to connect to the internet. It was created in Switzerland by Tim Berners-Lee, and World Economic Forum pointed to say in 1993, Berners-Lee and CERN announced that the code used for the World Wide Web would be freely available for anyone and everyone to use. So just even more connection, even more ability. Intel Paragon, this is just kind of an advancement off the Tanttila 16. It was $5 million for one piece block of those, and they generally built a lot of them together. It was the fastest supercomputer ever. And this is what was made originally, the idea of using advanced calculations. Windows 95, this is just another important operating system. I'm sure you've all heard like Windows, but you generally hear any old Windows, it's always Windows 95. So the idea of bringing good operating systems for easier use also became another big part. And then coming towards the end of the 90s, building on all this competition, you have the first iMac. It was multiple colors and it was $1,300. 512 pixels in 2012 quote job said that I stood for internet, individual, instruct, inform, and inspire. So this was the first iMac, and it was the first expansion of a really competitive environment, moving on to the era of getting advanced technology and smart technology.
Now, as we move from the 2000s into the more present age of technology, we see this shift from heavy competitiveness into a more cooperative and innovative environment, starting at 2000 with the first camera phone, which if you look at it, it looks very archaic to our standards, but at the time it was revolutionary for something so small to have a camera. And it was popular enough that soon after they introduced a flip model. This was also the same year that the PlayStation 2 released, which kind of marketed computers less towards professional and computing and more towards entertainment and having fun for games. And it was successful enough that Microsoft launched Xbox soon after this. Going into 2001 to 2003, the DARPA Sentibot project was to essentially take a bunch of robots and give them a hive mind to go into a dangerous space and clear out dangerous people, find people, dangerous objects, to essentially do the job of a military team, but safely with robots. And this kind of ties into the idea of Roombas, how you put them in a room and they can map the whole room all by themselves and vacuum it for you. So this kind of built off the group or individual advanced AI, as well as the McAfee G5 coming out this year, which was the first commercially available 64-bit processor computer. Most computers today are 64-bit. So you can say that this computer kind of pioneered the idea of having a common household 64-bit computer. Going into 2004, we had the rover landings of Opportunity and Spirit on Mars. They were both successful landings with successful missions. And this was a big step in the space industry as it pushed computers along through the space field, as well as we got more information off of Mars. And going into 2005 to 2009, Arduinos became commercially available, which I've used one before. It's a little red-like circuit board that you can plug and play with wires and get to circuitry and coding with them. And they're very hobbyist friendly. They're easy to learn. That's why they were so popular at the time. As well as in 2007, the iPhone and MacBook released, where everymac.com updated 2021 stated that the original iPhone featured a 3.5-inch display with 320 by 480 resolution at 163 pixels per inch, which if you really think about it, that is a tiny screen compared to what we have now. And so then going into the very next year, from 2010 to present, in 2010, Apple started producing the Retina displays, which are the displays that they use now. They're much more, they look a lot better to your eye. They're supposed to capture a more lifelike quality of image, as well as the iPad released this year with it was supposed to be a phone style device with a laptop's functionality. And it had a long, intensive development process, but iMore in 2020 said that by 2010, Apple was ready to launch their new tablet, something Steve Jobs said was the most important product of his life. And if you look around, such as our school, we've adapted iPads to our everyday use. So obviously they succeeded. Going into 2011, this was a big time for Apple in their development and research, as they also announced their Siri AI, which is their flagship AI that they still use today. But sadly, this was also the year that Steve Jobs passed away. This was big for the computer industry, as he was essentially seen as the face of Apple, who was likely one of the biggest tech giants at the time. So losing him was a big blow to the industry, as they essentially lost the face of part of their industry. Going into 2012 to 2014, the Raspberry Pi released, which is a small mini-sized circuit board that were very popular at the time for hobbyists and smaller coders, as they were very cheap and flexible for almost anything you wanted them for. It could run almost any computer process as long as it wasn't too intensive. And the Raspberry Pi Foundation stated that it is a capable little device that enables people of all ages to explore computing and learn how to program in languages like Scratch and Python. So in this earlier the earlier of the 21st century into these early 2010s, you see a lot of companies aiming more towards a hobbyist-friendly and beginner-friendly approach to computers. 2015 to 2016, Apple releases their first smartwatch, which was essentially to take the idea of a smartphone and put it on your wrist so you can have it wherever you wanted, as well as the first programmable quantum computer came out this year, which was exponentially faster than every other computer before it by using qubits or quantum bits to run multiple simulations at the same time. How this exactly works, I'm not a quantum scientist, I couldn't tell you, but this was revolutionary for this year, and so that's why. And going into 2017, 2018, the DARPA project for molecular informatics started, which aimed to create computers through the use of molecules. And from DARPA's site, Ann Fisher 2017 says millions of molecules exist, and each molecule has unique three-dimensional atomic structure, as well as variables such as shape, size, or even color. And they basically wanted to make computers through using molecules and their properties, as well as RTX graphics cards coming out this year. If you're a gamer, this is pretty important for you, as they would let you in real time do accurate reflections and lightings and simulations in games, which was revolutionary for games at this time, as more developers started putting these technologies into their games, and it made them just much more realistic. And then going into 2019, 2020, this was a smaller chunk of years. The Galaxy Fold released, which was it looked like a phone, but you could flip it out to be more like a tablet. And a lot of people liked this versatility of the two. And it was popular enough that the next year, the Galaxy Flip released, which was essentially the same thing, but it was a flip phone instead. And then finally going into 2020, the metaverse was announced, which aims to create a more true VR world that you can interact, work, buy stuff, essentially live in. And CNBC in 2022 says the metaverse describes software and hardware that allows users to play or work in virtual 3D spaces or pull in information from the internet and integrate it with the real world in real time. And I decided to end with this because I think it kind of encapsulates how we've grown our technology over time from simple computers into these much more usable, livable spaces of computing.
And throughout time, as computers have changed, whether it be from world wars or from just competition of the computing world, computers have changed a significant amount over the years, and it'll be exciting to see how they change in the future. Thank you.
I have 1946.
1947.
But yeah, thank you.
Or log out, so the other people can log in. And as soon as somebody from Smells Like Teen Spirit is ready, you can come by here and get your stuff starting to be set up.
So when do you want the stopwatch up at 18?
20.
Up at 20?
Yeah.
Oh, that's the end of
That's the
the
ending
time.
time.
It's 15 to 20.
It made me really nervous.
No, you guys were in time. So.
It's like I knew I cut some out, and I'm like, I don't think it would
I was
have.
gonna say, I thought I cut enough out to be like right perfect in the window.
Yeah, and I cut it with decent chunks.
Yeah.
One thing I'll say collectively.
Your speech was just a little bit over 5 minutes. Dylan's was about 7.
Well, yeah.
It was horrible.
I don't know, it was so difficult, I find to like get the important pieces to cover enough.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
like, it's so weird to cover this just one section, it's like the whole section. If we all had like another minute.
Right. So you might want to share.
I got 6 for Abby.
I found it so funny.
I only did that so
often. People are like, school idea, but I hate it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I just watched the South Park post-COVID episode.
Yeah,
Have you seen
I
that?
got 6 for Abby.
I like a little bit of it.
It's
There
great.
were a couple where I decided, like,
It's great. And one of the things is that
Yeah,
they're all older, they're all like 40. All the characters are. They drive by South Park School and everybody's in the playground with their children. It's that,
Yeah.
we're doing decent on time. We do need to get going in a couple of minutes.
Check in cheese evaluations later.
Oh, you got a couple. Can you do it in a couple minutes? Yeah, figure it out back there. If you went yesterday, I'll try to get your grades plugged in by the end of the day. That way, you know, kind of your final grade where you stand. By all means, on anything, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to explain myself. Jack, do you have a copy of? We're excited. Yeah. Yeah, you can keep working on it. How is it word Peter used to describe a person?
Person that would compute.
Oh, okay.
like if she just computer.
Okay. Okay, yeah, just add ER to whatever.
There's
you
people
do.
with the like weird box with the V and slide around.
Advocates.
Yeah, those. That's just what the person.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised you know that word. I'm impressed that you know that word.
Yeah.
They actually.
Yeah,
use it.
advocates.
What do you use it for? Conservation?
It's actually pretty handy to understand how it's done.
Or for a topic selection?
That's okay.
Ouch. Ouch. Old person. Computers.
Hey, Lord. All right, we should probably get going here. Not rush this out. I can make my 10th graders wait in the hall. I'm going to write them a note right now, actually. Here, before we go. I'll be ready within a minute. All right, smells like team spirit. What is your topic?
Evolution of piracy.
Excellent. Audience, are you ready?
Yep.
Group, are you ready?
Yep.
And proceed.
When you think of pirates, you probably think of Jack Sparrow, drunken pirates, Blackbeard, and big ships, right? But that's not typically what happens. It's often misportrayed in the Hollywood media and romanticized, so to speak. So you don't really see what pirates are truly about. Today, that's what we would like to inform you of, how they evolved over time with technology in 3 different ages that are most notably called the ancient, the golden age, and modern piracy.
Now, ancient pirates trace back to the Mediterranean, specifically in 400 BC. Now, as you can see here, these inscribed tablets are the first form of international diplomacy. They were found in ancient Egypt. They are called the Amana Papers, according to a World History article from 2015. Now, with these Amana Papers, since they're the first form of international diplomacy and trade, this allows for trade to start evolving, and especially since the Mediterranean is such a small ocean with a lot of different nations surrounding it, it was the perfect birthplace for piracy since there was a lot of trade on a smaller ocean. And specifically, these papers first mentioned Lucca, which, according to a World History article 2011, lived in the Near East, which is that green section on the map right there. But there's multiple different countries around the Mediterranean, and thus multiple different ethnic peoples that make up piracy in ancient times. Thus, they were called the sea people, since we haven't been able to figure out a lot of the different ethnicities that were around the area. And the main way to describe all these different pirates is to look at Rome and their interactions with pirates, specifically the Illyrians and the Sicilians. Now, according to a World History article from 2019, the Illyrians and the Sicilians were these main enemies of Rome, with the Illyrians being this more militaristic expansionist force, while the Sicilians were generally just pirates. Now, the Illyrians were specifically run by Queen Tanttila, who was a really expansionist militaristic leader who used pirates to expand her territory. And she was not going to change any of her policies for any different government, specifically Rome. Essentially, when Rome came to meet Tubular, according to an all that's interesting article from this past year, when these merchants came to her saying, like, can you call off your pirates? She decided that she wasn't going to listen to any of them because it was her policies, and piracy was legal and really valued in her country. Thus, she ended up taking the merchants basically captive, basically becoming a pirate herself. And as for the Sicilians, they lived on the rockiest area of the Mediterranean Sea, thus making soils in a lot of poor nutrient areas. So farming, they were originally farmers, and they weren't able to provide any money for themselves, thus having to resort to piracy. And since they were farmers, they had no experience with piracy, and it can easily be seen in an Encyclopedia Britannica article discussing the Sicilian capture of the most famous Roman name that we've heard of, Julius Caesar. And essentially, when Julius Caesar was taken captive by these Sicilian pirates, he basically took over the ship in a sense that he started bossing all the pirates around. He would read them poetry and essentially mock these pirates, calling them imbeciles whenever they didn't want to listen to him. And eventually, even raising his ransom money because they didn't realize who he was and he wanted to show them who was boss. And eventually, both the Illyrians and the Sicilians fell to Rome, and Rome eventually fell as well, leaving more room for different empires to grow around the Mediterranean. And eventually, the Americas were discovered during the Age of Exploration, thus expanding piracy from this little ocean into the Atlantic Sea, thus starting the Golden Age of piracy.
And as Nicole just said, the Golden Age of piracy initiated with the discovery of the Americas. According to the Golden Age of piracy, it didn't start with the discovery of the Americas, but it included what came with the Americas. What later on came was the Atlantic slave trade. And according to the Way of Pirates, the lack of Navy support during this time allowed for pirates to reign free during these times because there was no Navy and they didn't have any ways to protect their waters. Pirates during this time relied heavily on simple technology that they had. A lot of their technology with guns and cannons was not as popular as you would think. Guns would misfire, they weren't accurate, they just overall they were slow to reload and just not very efficient for pirates to use. But some pirates thought otherwise.
One of these pirates is Blackbeard, as you can see there, with 6 pistols strapped around him. He would keep these with him at all times when he was pirating, because guns, if they weren't reliable, it was either necessary to carry a lot of them or to not use them at all. And he figured just having them as a backup in case anything went wrong or sideways, he could have them to protect himself and his crew. So he was one of the most well-known for many weapons, although there weren't many of them.
Some of the other weapons used were grenades, and most commonly they were glass bottles filled with either gunpowder or sulfur. Gunpowder would be used more for explosive, where the sulfur was more for a smoke screen. And according to the World History Encyclopedia, handheld weapons were the most common. That includes your swords, axes, clubs, and things like that. The most common sword before your typical dueling sword you see in movies was called a cutlass. And that was a 3-foot long, heavy duty sword, almost like a machete, that would again be used for defending, attacking. It would be used for cutting down trees, opening up coconuts for wherever these pirates may be or whatever they were needed for. Traveling technology was also very simple during this time. The astrolabe and the ditch dial were devices that relied upon the use of star alignments to determine the location of where they are and where they are heading. According to the Pirate Show Cancun, the lodestone was also commonly used. A lodestone is a stone that can magnetize a small piece of metal. By using a small piece of metal, such as a small pin and a string, you would rub the pin on the lodestone, and you would hold up the string, and the pin would locate the north and south poles, so you could determine which way you were going. These traveling technologies These technologies also determined the ways in which pirates tortured one another. The tactics of which they would use to get hold of the merchandise. To get hold of the merchandise, it heavily relied on speed. Speed was the name of the game. If you can attack something, get a hold of the ship, it oftentimes led to great success. This is not a new tactic, however.
Most of the typical pirate ships that you see are based off of the Lembas, Queen Tubular's design. And essentially, the Lembas was this small, agile craft that could shift into shallow waters and inlets, especially rocky areas, since the Mediterranean was such a rocky coast that had lots of different inlets in it. If you can get to shallow water in these inlets, no one's going to be able to track you. Thus, it was a really beneficial idea that was used throughout the Golden Age.
Barbary corsairs were also influenced into the Golden Age of piracy with their tactics of attacking ships. Barbary corsairs were Muslim pirates that reigned in the Mediterranean during the ancient times, and their ways of taking hold of a ship was by jamming the rudder with wooden wedges, which prevented the ship from steering away, and then finishing the job with hand-to-hand combat. This was very effective and led to a lot of success for pirates to maintain and get a hold of a lot of merchandise. Flags were very threatening for anyone crossing the Atlantic. A lot of times, a lot of these merchandise ships would just surrender right away if they even saw one of these flags, because they either knew they're either gonna get killed or they're gonna lose their job for losing the merchandise. So either way, it was a lose-lose situation. In terms of defending themselves, the National Museum stated how grease and broken glass would be spread across the decks of these ships in order to slow down the attack of these pirates coming on board, in hopes to try to maintain control of their ship and try to get away. Torture during this time was also dependent on the technology they had, and since they had very basic technology, their torture methods were very, very cruel and not very torturous in the ways that we see in movies of how they can use technology that we have today. Obviously, they didn't have that, so it had to be very simple. When it came to crewmates, a lot of their punishments were floggings and keel haulings. Now, floggings was using a cat of nine tails, which was a switch that had 9 tails instead of 1. So when you were lashed, it was by 9 lashes at one time. Keel hauling was used for more severe punishments, and that was tying an individual up and dragging them under the hull of the ship. Now, if the individual didn't die from drowning, they had huge wounds on their back, and which could lead to infection, and this was caused from barnacles that lie under the hull of ships. When it came to innocent captives, a lot of times pirates just wanted to get them to spill the beans of where the loot is, but some pirates were just simply plain cruel in their methods.
One of these pirates was Englishman Edward Lowe, who was a famous pirate in the Caribbean. He was known almost exclusively for his torture methods. He has 3 big stories. 2 of them are connected. Now, the one that's not connected to the 2 was he once had a Portuguese captain throw their purse off so they couldn't get the loot inside. And so he cut off his lips and forced him to eat them. And that was just one thing he did. That was only a one-time thing. But he also was known for taking ears of people he captured. And one time he made someone cut off their own ears and eat them. And he also made him eat the heart that he had one of his own crewmates cut the heart out of one of the other captives and feed it to them. So they had to essentially eat a living heart. And he was just overall known for being barbaric and not really giving any quarter to who he captured.
However, Edward Lowe his methods were not very common. A lot of times it was humiliation, such as making these captives run across the deck for hours on end, throwing them in a barrel full of cockroaches, things that were harmful, but they didn't necessarily weren't going to kill you right away. Walking the plank is very stereotypical. You think of pirates, but it really wasn't as common as you think. And they think it was because it wasn't entertaining to watch, and you really just lose any possible way to try to get the loot of these captives. According to the World History Encyclopedia article that talked about catching pirates, they oftentimes led to public hangings when they were caught. And when these pirates were hung, they didn't die from a broken neck in these hangings. It was oftentimes from strangulation. And overall, the crackdown of piracy began, and these public hangings became more and more common. When it came to modern piracy, a lot of the technology changed. Steamboats were made. Progressive eras such as ending slavery and starting to crack down on these pirates was why the Golden Age started to end. And according to the National Museum, the Atlantic crackdown was initiated by a Caribbean governor who had really stressed why we need to stop piracy. So that was the initiative in the Caribbean. And according to the Way of Piracy, the Dark Age was kind of started, and it didn't come up until the 1960s of where more piracy began.
As Connor said, most of modern piracy emerged during the 1960s, specifically away from the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean, as well as seas around Middle Eastern countries.
Most notably, the seas here are the Gulf of Aden, the Arabian Sea, and the Gulf of Oman that are around Somalia. Somalia was a war-torn country at the time of modern piracy starting to flare up again. They were in a civil war, and so there was aid being sent and things that were very easily pirated, because people sending aid to a country in civil war don't typically expect to be attacked or have what they have on board to be stolen. So it was very easy targets coming into the Gulf of Aden here, trying to help the northern or southern side. There was a lot of piracy happening, and it's actually stated in an article from Relief Web in 2021 that there was an increase from 2018 to 2019 of about 60% of small piracy incidents. these commonly occur here due to this civil war is mostly over, but there's still conflict, turmoil, and famine because it is a desert country for the most part, and they need aid, but it's not being able to get to them. Another place that is common is in the Strait of Malacca here by Indonesia, where there's a lot of islands for them to hop to get away. These are typically just like smaller fold-ups, or sometimes there will be big ships that get taken by using methods of new technology.
New technology has affected in which ways have pirates have used their tactics, but when it comes to just getting around, a lot of it is the same as the golden age. They use small, fast boats to get to these ships because big boats can't maneuver around fast. And the weapons have become more dangerous, with the weapons finally becoming more and more efficient and reliable. So a lot of times they use assault rifles, RPGs, grenades, but they are more so used for a threatening device such as the RPG, because if they immediately blow up a ship, it can overall not allow them to get the loot that they're trying to get. So a lot of it is a lot of intimidation and trying to get hold of the ship.
They also use this speed from their new boats that have higher horsepower engines to go fast, and they use these ships that they'll capture. They're slightly bigger. They're flagships, they're called, and they're essentially a moving base for these pirates. They'll get away from them easy, and this is how they score their larger takes. Is they'll have a flagship and they'll try and get onto large chemical tankers, typically oil tankers. There was one from Germany, from ICC, the International Maritime Bureau, in 2019, that stated there was roughly 20 captives on board this oil ship once it was taken by pirates, and they would essentially take the oil and they'd scoop it up and transport it away themselves instead of trying to port the ship. They would also have medium targets known as just their typical takes of, like, the Gulf of Oman, like I previously mentioned, has a lot of tourists go through because it is close to Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which, if you know anything about there, people who go there and leave from there are typically rolling in dough, so that's easy money for them. And they also hold up small fishermen. This is more common in that Strait of Malacca area because there's so many fishermen out by these coral reefs. There's so much diversity, so many fish that can be caught. So it is very notable that that's where a lot of small piracy comes in, as typically petty thefts acting alone. They use their speed to sneak up on them because now with the technology out, with communication like radios and long distance communications, like even cell phones around the Strait of Malacca, they can't like be announcing their presence with flags or zooming up to them right away because they will be called in. So they typically try and sneak around and get around that way. A modern pirate, an easy example, was Ali Jama. He was the one who took that tanker I was talking about previously. He was the one who boarded that, and in a article from the Virginian Plot, it's actually stated that he was finally taken in from, he attacked the yacht Quest, which had Virginian passengers on it, so they decided to prosecute him in a Virginian district court. He got 2 life sentences, and that was where he was apprehended. Now, they also torture in the modern age as well, except it's more surface level. It's not like throwing people in barrels with cockroaches. It's simply like getting beat with a bamboo cane until you tell them, or saltwater treatment where they'll basically steal all the fresh water you had and you have to drink salt water from there on out, or simple starvation where they don't give you the food that you had packed. They will eat that and you're almost starved until the brink of death. And the most notable thing was from the US Sun, is where all that information came from. And the New York Times in 2016 had an article about Michael Scott Moore, who is probably the most known example of modern torture. Now, Michael Scott Moore is actually an accomplished article writer and a journalist. When he went out there, he actually wrote a book called The Desert and the Sea. It was about his 977 days out there where he was tortured almost every day. Typically, he would have 2 to 3 sessions a day. Sometimes it would be 1 or even 0. It really depended on how the pirates were feeling. And that was how he was tortured, was simply the bamboo cane, salt water. They would lay him out in the sun, hogtied, so he would dehydrate faster as well. And that was the most of the torture.
And overall, piracy is very similar to that of ancient piracy and golden age of piracy. Methods of pirates have not changed that much overall. Really just changed their methods to base off of the technology at the time. Specifically with faster boats with horsepower engines, or the RPGs making capturing ships a lot easier, especially since they like to do a lot more capturing ships or hostage situations, as well as having to adapt to like modern threats to piracy, like specifically distress calls, like Jack had mentioned. Overall, despite having to switch literal motions, piracy has evolved and still continues to this day, just adapting to whatever technology they have. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff,
1841,
what else did you have?
07.
Oh, 1841, 49. I thought that was our last chance to do it. That was our last chance.
My mouth got dry, so.